Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series. My name is Anaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. We are pleased to be joined today by Mr. Joel Burnie, Executive Manager at the Australia, Israel, and Jewish Affairs Council, joining us this week to discuss the topic of Israel and Australia and the question of whether or not they are still indeed allies. Mr. Burnie will speak and begin with a short lecture followed by a Q&A section. And please note that this is a pre-recorded broadcast to accommodate the time difference between here and Melbourne. So there will not be the option for our audience to ask their questions live. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Joel Burnie. Joel, good afternoon from here in Denver, and good morning to you in Australia.
Thank you very much for having me, and to our audience there who's watching me after it's on recall. And it's great to be with you. I'm sorry that I can't field your questions live, but I hope that with what I cover in my introductory remarks covers the spread and really gives you an update as to the situation that we find ourselves in. Quick thank you to Middle East Forum, AIJAC, my organization. Middle East Forum have had a long association with each other. And I'm delighted to be a guest for your podcast series. Just very briefly about my organization, which will sort of give you the background as to what I'm going to talk about. So I work for a very amazing organization called the Australia, Israel, and Jewish Affairs Council. We are many things, but what we do is that we're a premier public affairs organization. We have a think tank division and policy division, but what we also do is we also build and maintain relationships with policymakers in Australia, whether that be in government, with members of parliament or the bureaucracy, whether or not that's with clergy or with students, or anyone in Australian civil society that has something to contribute to the bilateral relationship between Australia and Israel. AIJAC as an organization invests in building those relationships. And the pinnacle program that AIJAC has that really does this to the best impact is our Rambam program. And our Rambam program is our program where we send mainly non-Jews to Israel. So currently, well over 50% of the federal parliament has been to Israel on AIJAC programs. And it's important because when we talk about policy development and the potential changes that have occurred since the election of the Labor government in 2022, some of these characters are actually graduates of our Rambam program that we've had relationships with for a long time. So it sort of gives the audience an understanding as to what the organization does and what I'm doing here, telling you, the audience, as to what's going on here down under in terms of our bilateral relationship with Israel. So let's start with the end first and work our way backwards. So I would posit that since the election of the Labor government, Anthony Albanese as the Prime Minister in 2022, there has been a departure in long-standing and historic bipartisan position on Israel. Okay, so let's just repeat that we're working our way backwards, that there is definitely a departure from long-standing bipartisan positions on Israel and on the bilateral relationship since the government came into power in 2022. But you can't just look at 2022 as a starting point and then see what's happened afterwards. You really need to zoom out and have a look at what happened before and see where the trajectory was going and how this all came about. So historically, I made mention of that very strong bipartisan position on Israel. And apart for a few years in the 70s under a former Labor Prime Minister in Gough Whitlam, since 1947 and since the historic vote at the General Assembly, where Australia was the first country to vote for the establishment of a Jewish state in support of the Partition Plan in 1947, that's for alphabetical reasons, but anyway, historically, Doc Evatt, who was Australia's foreign minister at the time, was the head of the UN committee that actually recommended partition. And it was in Doc Evatt's opinion that the establishment of a Jewish homeland in the ancestral biblical homeland of the Jewish people in Israel through the mechanism of the partition plan was something that not only did the Australian government agree with at the time in 1947, but actually played a key role in the development of that. So Labor as a party and Australia as a country did play a large role in the establishment of the state in the late 40s. And since then, both the centre-right Liberal government, which we call our Conservative governments as the Liberal Party, and also the Labor Party have been staunch allies of Israel. And the way that you would illustrate that in modern, well, in historic times, you had prime ministers, Labor prime ministers like Bob Hawke, who not only tried very, very hard and was pivotal in rescinding the UN resolution, Zionism is Racism resolution, but also was very hands-on and involved in the plight of Soviet Jewry in the 70s and the 80s. So he has a proud history of representation of Jewish people, but also in defense of Israel. And that was subsequently held by other prime ministers, most notably the most recent Labor prime minister before this current Labor prime minister, and that was Julia Gillard, who was a very strong friend of Israel as well. The illustration of that strength of the bilateral relationship, and the bipartisan relationship could really be evidenced by lots of things, but one of the clearest ways is UN votes. So on certain UN votes, when you would see the United States amongst a handful of Pacific Island countries, the most staunch Western ally to the position of the United States vis-a-vis their bilateral relationship with Israel and the way that they voted in international forums, you would see Australia standing side by side with the United States. So there was an unquestioned alliance and strength to the relationship that really was bipartisan since the establishment of the state in 1947. But then things started to change. And there's no real one major reason for that change. There are multiple small ones. And if you look back into the history, the change happened, one of the most illustrative changes that happened in 2012. So when the United Nations General Assembly was voting on unilateral recognition of Palestinian statehood and admission as a member state, the Prime Minister at the time, Julia Gillard, wanted to vote no. But she was defeated in the party room by the foreign minister at the time, whose name is Bob Carr, who did not have favorable positions on Israel at that time. And he swayed the majority of the party room to shift the prime minister's position from a no vote to an abstention. Now, that may not have had a giant impact on the overall vote of the General Assembly, but what it did show was the beginnings and the fragility of the positions inside Labor vis-a-vis Israel. Okay, and that was led by this foreign minister, Bob Carr. Now, someone would say, well, what happened to Bob? So Bob in the late 70s was a staunch friend of Israel and actually set up the Labor Friends of Israel in the late 70s and was the longest serving premier of one of our largest states in New South Wales, one of our largest states in Australia called New South Wales. And he is a member of the factional right side of the Labor Party versus the factional left side. And traditionally at a federal level, the right has been ascendant, meaning the right faction has more votes and delegates than the left faction. And that was historically true. However, that has now shifted over the past 3 to 5 years, which is again another reason as to this potential shift, or this actual shift inside Labor. So in 2004, as Premier of New South Wales, he decided that he would support the giving of the Sydney Peace Prize to Hanan Ashrawi. And that was the beginning of Bob's departure from the Jewish community and Israel, and then he became very vocal supporter of Palestine, but most specifically in the pursuit of unilateral recognition of Palestine. And then since 2012, inside the party room where he was able to overrule the Prime Minister, the party has, over lots of different occasions through that time, illustrated its change in rhetoric and also change in position vis-a-vis Israel. Okay, and during that time period, up from 2013 to 2022, the Labor Party was in opposition federally. So all of the things that happened up until the time that they got into government happened whilst they were in opposition. So it didn't impact Australia's policy as a sovereign nation. But what it did do was clearly show that there was a movement away from the historic bipartisan position on Israel, and Labor's position on Israel started to change. And then what we saw is through in 2012, we had the Bob Carr issue, but then at national conferences, which is where the main policies are debated inside the Labor Party, Palestinian recognition became one of the biggest tension items. And then through successive years and successive national conferences, the Labor Party as a national body, with the national body creates the policy and the manifesto for the party, has agreed on with sequential national conferences, the unilateral recognition of Palestine. Now, the motion itself inside the Labor platform does give the power to the National Caucus and the National Cabinet to be able to make that decision. So ultimately, the decision of unilateral recognition of Palestine is still a matter for the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, and Cabinet. However, the party itself has on multiple occasions endorsed the recognition of the unilateral recognition of Palestine, which would be a massive departure from long-standing historic bipartisan positions on Israel. Now, that was the pre-Labor, before they got into government. And then when Labor got into government, or just before they got into government, the concerns of the Jewish community were well noted and publicized. And the Prime Minister, well, the opposition leader at the time and the shadow foreign minister at the time, on many occasions right before the election, addressed the concerns of the Jewish community. So the Prime Minister endorsed the IRA definition, the working definition on anti-Semitism before the election, showing his strength and position vis-a-vis anti-Semitism. But also there were claims that there would be no major departures in that long-standing bipartisan position on Israel. And that, unfortunately, has not turned out to be true. And so what happened was, as soon as the Labor government got into power in 2022, things started to change. Now, they didn't change dramatically overnight. They were incremental changes, a slow burn. And what we started to see a departure on how Australia handled itself at the United Nations. So not only did it alter some of its votes, but it would also not sign on to resolutions led by the United States and co-signed by like-minded Western nations on one-sided resolutions against Israel. Australia decided to go on its own and put up its own resolutions if it thought that the forum was one-sided against Israel. So that was the start of the sort of the first signs of the differences, subtle changes in UN votes and subtle changes on the way that they behaved at the United Nations. But then on Simchat Torah in 2022, we had the big one, right? And that was the reversal of Australia's recognition of Western Jerusalem as Israel's capital. So the former Morrison government of the centre-right Liberal Party had recognized West Jerusalem in the context of President Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Australia did its own investigation and decided that it would recognize the western part of the city as Israel's capital. Unfortunately, the Morrison government did not move the embassy, the physical building of the embassy. However, that recognition of West Jerusalem was there. And then the Labor government in late 2022 decided to reverse that decision. And that was a real kick to the guts for the Australian Jewish community. And we were very upset and concerned about that. The timing of it was also poor because it happened on a Chag, which made it very difficult for the Jewish community to do anything about it. But that was a major decision of the incoming government. Their justification is that the previous government had used domestic issues to justify their decision of recognition of the western part of Jerusalem, and that their foreign policy would not be shaped by the domestic issues that was facing Australia. They would have an independent foreign policy, one of a mature foreign policy, and one that was not impacted by what they claimed was cynical domestic politics. That also didn't turn out to be accurate. Before October 7, and then straight after a Labor conference where there was significant pressure from multiple sources inside the party to unilaterally recognize Palestine, the government decided to alter the lexicon as to how it would refer to the West Bank and Gaza. They were for now going to refer to it as occupied Palestinian territory, recognizing the occupation, not distinguishing the difference between Gaza and the West Bank, or East Jerusalem for that matter, but claiming that all territory conquered in June 1967 was occupied Palestinian territory, meaning from us, the extension of Palestinian sovereignty that had never existed on these areas, that they were preempting that final status agreement by referring to those lands conquered in June 1967, including East Jerusalem, and thus referring to them as occupied Palestinian territory. So, ladies and gentlemen, just to sum up, before the events of October 7, we had concerns as to how the Labor Party was departing from a historic bipartisan position on Israel. But then when they came into power, they did show their true colors in the change in the UN votes and also with the removal of the recognition of West Jerusalem. Now, post-October 7, things have unfortunately got worse. So in the early stages, the government was quite strong in referencing Israel's right to self-defense and also claiming that Hamas has no role in the future governance of Gaza. And those two things have remained. The Prime Minister is steadfast on those two things. However, over the past couple of months, there have been major incidents where the government has not supported Israel's position. And that is clearly at the ICJ, that is at the ICC, and that is also in terms of Israel's operation in Rafah. So the government's language on this has been specifically strong. The government has warned Israel against an operation in Rafah and consistently calls Israel out for what it claims are humanitarian issues, and that it keeps maintaining its position that Israel has responsibilities under humanitarian law, which Israel accepts and Israel does. So since the start of October 7, the real problems inside the party have become even more evident and more illustrative. You have rogue MPs that cannot answer simple questions as to whether or not what's going on is a genocide or what's going on in Israel in terms of Israel proper, but also the West Bank and Gaza is apartheid. So you have these rogue senior MPs inside the party that are not towing the party line. A week and a half ago, you had a federal Labor senator get up in Parliament and use the chant "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." So you have, and these issues are kind of reflective as to what's happening inside elements of the Democratic Party, obviously for different reasons, but there are certain correlations and connections between a shift mainly of the younger generation inside the United States and also in Australia, but also with a shift with that hardcore, rusted-on pro-Israel element within the Democratic Party and a much more vocal progressive left wing of the party. Similar things are happening inside the ALP. Now, just to summarize as to where to from here. So before October 7 and after October 7, the government has not been overly strong in reinforcing the credentials as to what made a very historic and very important bilateral alliance between Israel and Australia. At some stages, and certainly in the early stages after October 7, the language was very strong. But there's been a departure from that for many reasons, and I hope to get that in the question and answers to give you clarity as to why I think that that's happened. But there has been a clear departure from this government from previous governments in terms of the relationship, both before October 7 and also after October 7. The concern is now we have one more year until the next election. The concern is what to from here. My suggestion is that this government will maintain its current trajectory. It will try and have a bob each way. It will try and seem to be supportive of Israel's right to self-defense and consistently note that Hamas is a terror organization. But at the same time, there are points where the equivalence between the ridiculous and toxic equivalence between Hamas and Israel does feed into some of the language of some of the members of parliament inside the Labor Party. So the only thing really left on the table, one of the major things left on the table, is unilateral recognition of Palestine. It's currently inside their party platform to do it. It's at the prerogatives of the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, and the Cabinet to decide to do it. But in light of Norway, Ireland, Spain, and potentially others, it's certainly back on the agenda inside the party. And with 12 months left to the next election, I dare say that there would be a probability, more so than a possibility, that this government will unilaterally recognize Palestine before the next election. So thank you for that, short 17 minutes or so of the summary of where we're at. I look forward to answering some of your questions.
Oh, well, thank you for that briefing, and thank you for the historical context And I'm sure many of my viewers are not quite as familiar with some of the happenings that go on in Australia, so it was very insightful. I'll begin by asking about something you touched on briefly, which is the recent International Criminal Court application for the arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, recently, Anthony Albanese simply stated in response to the application that he would not comment on court processes to which Australia is not a party. Now, why would he offer such a cautious and ambiguous response rather than stating outright that the ICC's attempts to equate the democratic state of Israel with the genocidal terrorist organization Hamas is simply absurd?
So it's an example of what I said before. They have a bob each way. So on the one hand, he'll say there's no equivalence between Hamas and Israel. But then he'll say, but I support the court. We like the court, and we'll see what the court says. So the court itself, the prosecutor, in pursuing the arrest warrants, did make a clear equivalence between Hamas and Israel. So to sort of sanction and support the prosecutor's moves for the warrant because you support the court sort of tacitly suggests that you also agree with the prosecutor's equivalence between Hamas and Israel. So they again try and have the bob each way. They say on the one hand the good thing, and on the other hand they say, well, we'll support the court. Now this whole thing about not commenting on court matters that they're not a party to, it's again not an overly accurate statement, because there are many court cases that have with Julian Assange, for instance, who I think is currently at the UK Court of Appeal. The Prime Minister himself and the party has been quite vocal on their desires to have Julian Assange come back to Australia. There are many cases where the government does make a stated position on a certain case. The previous government, for instance, sent an amicus brief to the ICC to confirm the Australian government's position is that the previous prosecutor did not have jurisdiction in the case. That is a matter that's also open to this current government to put an amicus brief to the ICC to say or to highlight concerns with the process or the lack of jurisdiction that the ICC has on Israel. But it hasn't shown any desire to do so, and I dare say that it won't. So the Prime Minister was asked again yesterday because he noted that the reporting of his previous comments were unsatisfactory. But again, all he does is reaffirm the broad position of the government in terms of the whole conflict in Gaza, as opposed to specifically the ICC, but then claims because it's just a suggestion or a request for a warrant, Australia is waiting for the ICC to make a ruling on the warrant before it makes its determination as to whether or not it's going to support it or not. So on the one hand, you have the United States, Canada, and the UK with much stronger language, and then Australia is somewhere in the middle to the countries that aren't overly friendly. So that within itself is a clear illustration of that departure from that historic, long-standing bipartisan position on Israel.
Well, thank you. Now, earlier this week on Sky News, the Liberal MP Andrew Wallace said on, I think it was Chris Kenny's program, quote, "The Labour Party of Australia are backing Hamas over Israel." Do you think that is a fair assessment overall?
Look, I like Andrew a lot. He's a fantastic servant to the country and a dear friend to Israel. But no, I don't. Look, there are bad elements inside the party for sure, but there are senior Jewish members and senior pro-Israel members inside the federal cabinet and inside caucus. So whilst we had the Victorian State Conference where this was just 2 weekends ago, or last weekend actually, when Jewish members of the Labor Party were not only heckled before they got into the hall by pro-Palestinian elements, but were also heckled inside by some fellow delegates. So it's getting worse, and after October 7, the veracity of the debate inside the party is also getting worse. But I would stop short in saying that they are supporting Hamas. I don't believe. I don't believe that the Prime Minister or the Foreign Minister had any desires to support Hamas, not only in their public statements, but I would certainly say it's true for their opinions as well, that the cabinet, the caucus, the whole federal government, well, the leaders of the federal government are certainly anti-Hamas and recognise that Hamas is a terror organisation. Its listing is justified. So no, sometimes their policies are inadvertently the positions that Hamas would want them to take. So voting in the General Assembly, for instance, and calling for an immediate ceasefire, that was something that Hamas went on Twitter and supported. So there are things that Hamas likes of the positions of this government, but that is not to say that this government is motivated for any type of supportive reasons towards Hamas.
Now, here in the United States, we've seen plenty of surveys and polls which suggest that, by and large, Americans overwhelmingly support Israel over Hamas in the conflict, despite the prominent and vocal demonstrations and encampments on campuses across the country. Now, is this also the case among the Australian public, particularly among the voter base of the Labor Party?
So there hasn't been a huge amount of polling that's been done. But the polling that has been done confirms the following. It confirms that absolutely there is more support for Israel in Australia and the Australian public than Hamas, but also the Palestinians more broadly. The support is with Israel in a two-pronged battle between support for Palestinians in general. What is interesting is that support for Israel has dropped a little bit after October 7, but support for the Palestinians has not proportionally increased. So what I'd suggest that is twofold. Firstly, you have to understand that geographically, Australia is very far from Israel, and Australia is very far from everyone. So the Australian public, its default position on foreign wars is to not really care too much about it. Now, obviously, the impact of this specific war has had huge impacts on lots of Australians here. So not only is there an exponential increase in anti-Semitism, but as you say, with the very vocal protests and the encampments, it's very hard to live your life in an Australian city without having, this conflict shoved in your face by the very vocal and organized pro-Palestinian movement. I think that in Australia, I think the behaviour of certain pro-Palestinian elements is counterintuitive to increasing their support. They hijacked the Carols by Candlelight, a Christmas event in December last year, where they went on stage and did a protest on stage. That did not go down well with the Australian public. They were booed. Well, one of the protesters tried to interrupt the Australian Open in January at the tennis, and they were resoundingly booed and heckled by the crowd. I'm of, and many are of, the strong opinion that there is a silent majority here in Australia, a silent majority that dislikes the exponential rise in anti-Semitism, that feels sympathy and empathy for Australian Jews, but also recognises what's going on in Israel and in Gaza, recognises what Hamas did on October 7, recognises that if that same crime was perpetrated against Australians, that we would do the same, if not, be more aggressive than what the Israelis have been, and also recognise the fact that the propaganda coming out of the war, most in terms of the casualties and the accusations of starvation and other breaches of international humanitarian law, Australians have a decent BS barometer. So they can see through the weeds, and I do think that the polls will replicate that there is a silent majority of Australians that not only support the Australian Jewish community but also support Israel.
All right. Well, thank you. I think we have time for one more here. And I actually wanted to touch on the question of anti-Semitism and its rise in Australia recently. Now, if you'll recall, very shortly after the October 7th massacre in Israel, we heard chants of "Gas the Jews" by demonstrators outside of the Sydney Opera House. Around the same time, we saw anti-Semitic mobs targeting grieving families of the victims of the massacres from inside their hotel rooms. Now, it's very clear that they were empowered and motivated to air their beliefs in the wake of the October 7th attack. Now, how much do you think they were empowered to air their beliefs now that it seems like the Labour Party is starting to incorporate the recognition of a Palestinian state in their party platform?
So it's very important for the audience to understand that the problems of anti-Semitism happened way before an Israeli troop set their feet inside Gaza after October 7th. So we had 24 hours after the event, so October the 8th, in one of the most dominant Muslim areas in Western Sydney called Lakemba, you had certain Muslim preachers coming out to the streets, and amongst fireworks from the celebrating locals, he said how elated he was at what happened. No less than 2 days afterwards, on October the 9th, as you referred to, we had the incident at the Opera House. Now, Jews were told by the Attorney General of New South Wales and by the police to not come to the city, to not come to downtown to see the sails lit up in blue, because it was too dangerous for them, and they couldn't ensure their safety. And so this angry mob went to the steps of the Opera House and started chanting, "Kill the Jews for sure." F the Jews for sure. There's conjecture as to whether or not it was "gas the Jews" or "where's the Jews." But if it was "where's the Jews," they weren't calling us out to give us a warm embrace. They'd already said "F us," so what do they want to do when they hug us? So the fact that that happened on October 9th, right? So that's pure Jew hatred on the streets of Sydney, after the worst massacre of Jews that had happened since 1945, since the end of the Holocaust. So it cannot be justified within the lens of an alleged high civilian death count in Gaza. This all happened before the IDF even were close to going into Gaza. So the problems in Australia were clear, and I don't think that you can justify them as some type of angry response to the suffering of Gazan civilians. In saying that, in the connection as to, so what's the potential connection, if any, with this current federal government? So most Jews in Australia feel greatly insecure as to what's going on. So many Jews in Australia will take off their Jewish symbols, take off their yarmulke, maybe go and take off the mezuzah on the door, because we've had many incidents of intimidation. Not only is the intimidation on the one hand, it causes a lot of anxiety and angst, but the response or lack of response from the police in protecting Jews and their installations has not been satisfactory. So government does matter in terms of how it handles the increase in anti-Semitism. The other problem is that policies and statements made by the federal government can also embolden some of those pro-Palestinian protesters to do what they're doing, okay? So if the government's position is, or if government senior ministers, when asked a question in December of last year, is it genocide what's going on in Israel? Well, he says, they're not my words, but if it smells like a duck and all this type of, this not clearly articulating an answer, embolden the supporters on the streets to go, well, hold on, our federal government can't say that it's not genocide, or they can't say that it's not apartheid what's going on in Israel. So if we hold that position, we hold the same or similar positions to senior ministers. So there's that element there, but the biggest element is lack of leadership. So even if you need to do, like we have a compulsory voting system in Australia, okay? So everyone has to vote, and the voter turnout is in the high 80s, low 90s. And currently now the government is not in a winnable position. If the election was held now, it may retain majority government. It only has a 2-seat majority, by the way, right? So you need a majority in the lower house. It only has a 2-seat majority now. And with the machinations of certain independent parties and other things, they could either win in a slim majority or most likely win with a minority government. Now, minority governments are not common in Australia. They happen, but they're not common. So the government has made an assessment that if it takes a more pro-Palestinian line, it has a higher chance of winning the next election. it believes that some of the seats that it holds in Western Sydney, where there's a large Muslim population, that it may lose one or two of those seats to independents, not to give them to the opposition, but to independents, because of their positions vis-a-vis Gaza post-October 7. So they've made the calculation that if they're more pro-Palestinian, they will potentially have a higher probability of retaining government at the next election. Now, I would suggest, for lots of reasons that I won't get into now, that that's not necessarily a good idea. But they've certainly made it. They've made the choice. So they are not the cause of the anti-Semitism, but the lack of strong leadership in denouncing it and calling it out, and then going to the population centers of those that are responsible for it, that would assist in reducing the insecurity that the Jewish community feels right now. But that is something that the government has had trouble in doing. There was, after quite a lot of discussion and requests, there was a meeting of many rabbonim and rabbis with the Prime Minister a couple of weeks ago, but that hasn't altered what's going on the ground. To give you one example, probably 95% of the time over the past 7 months that this government has discussed anti-Semitism, the next two words that come out of their mouths after the word anti-Semitism is "and Islamophobia." So Islamophobia is a problem here in Australia. The Muslim population is a statistically targeted minority in Australia. There's no doubt about that, and faces discrimination, as do many other minority groups, including subsets of the plethora of Asian communities that we have in Australia. But at the same time, there is no comparison statistically between the incidence of Islamophobia versus anti-Semitism. And the unfortunate thing is that many of the people that have been arrested for crimes against Jews since October 7 have been Muslim, whereas no Jews, to my recollection, have been arrested for Islamophobic events against Muslims. So even though we recognize that it is a problem and it's a scourge on society and needs to be, we need to defeat it, but it's not, you cannot compare it both statistically or of its impacts in Australian civil society to that of the toxicity of anti-Semitism. So every time a Jew who was feeling greatly insecure, so for instance, late last year, my daughter, who goes to a Jewish school, who's protected by 2 armed guards, a massive fence and blast doors that you can't get into the school, but also they have weekly drills, emergency evacuation drills and things like this, but they had to move their sports carnival from a public park in November last year because the school couldn't secure it. So the threat is real. The sense of insecurity amongst the community is real as well. But the positions of the government in terms of Israel, but also the lack of strong leadership in not only denouncing anti-Semitism, which is the easy part, but it's actually doing something about it. Tangible things, doing something about it. It's something that, in my assessment, this government has had trouble doing. And my hope is that over the next 12 months or whenever the next election may be, that they find ways of making a material positive impact to the Australian Jewish community, because we need it, and we're looking for it and we're seeking it. And I think that this is something that the government can do out of good conscience, as opposed to trying to win seats or trying to placate the progressive left of the party in terms of its pro-Palestinian position.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Burnie. Your presentation has been so insightful. I wish we could keep going for another hour here. I've got a bunch of other questions I've prepared in advance, but unfortunately we have run out of time and come to the close of our podcast. I want to thank you again for taking the time to join us and to give us your presentation.
Thank you very much for having me. Look, to end on a positive note, the community here is very well organized and working as hard as we can, and we need to maintain our relationships and our contacts inside government, and we'll do whatever we can to show this current government that there are positives in maintaining that long-standing historic bipartisan relationship with Israel. Israel has a lot to offer in that relationship as well, and my hope is that with more awareness and more ideas as to what they can do, that the next 12 months will not be as rocky as the past 12. But we can only hope.
Well, we're very glad to hear that. And of course, we will do our best to support you every step of the way. For our viewers and listeners, please keep an eye on your email inboxes over the weekend for our upcoming podcast offerings. Once again, to our viewers and listeners, we thank you for joining us. To Mr. Joel Burnie, we thank you again.
And thank you very much for having me.
And as always, we hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and we thank you for joining us.